There goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight, there goes a sight. Now there goes a sight.
Don't give up when things get tough. Why? Why won't you give up? So about 2 years ago, I did a turnaround talk around the financial aspects and the psychology of company turnaround, and I think that's still relevant. But there's now a new challenge which I'd like to share. I think that the question is, how can we make meaning from the current environment, and how can we create people who care? I think it's about thinking. It's about the current actions which are escalating out of control, and the challenge is, how do we get back into control? But if we don't care and we're unable to take new action, there's a distinct danger of no resilience. I think there's really fundamental questions as well, which requires a broader perspective, such as, what are we doing here? And we're at a tipping point, choosing between the choice between humanity and the implications of inhumanity. And I think the other point is that our sanity is very much defined by people around us, and the challenge is, how many meaningful or challenging conversations have we had with what I describe as being beneficial adversaries, or have you fallen out with them? Because that's actually the wife's role in a relationship, to be your beneficial adversary. And I think the other issue is we're losing the ability to make sense of the issues and get a grip, which is hence the urgency for me to share this with you. More fundamentally, the question is, who do you put your faith in? And I think this really matters, because if people are proud, Jesus said the proud are an abomination, and the feeling of an abomination is something that causes disgust or loathing or a feeling of hatred. And I think this is pretty much what people are feeling about a lot of business at the moment. And I think that this whole notion of defining who you are is a complete nonsense. Without challenge, without that interaction, without that love between us, you sort of inflate till you burst. Following the series of talks I did, I shared the learnings from the 30 talks, which was captured in the top 7, and largely those have been ignored, but they seem to be coming to the fore now. Some of the elements, such as price increases, I think are materializing anyway. And I think the issue around thinking you know better is an interesting one. But I think the challenge is, for a lot of businesses, is that people just don't care and they're losing interest. Alongside that, there are misleading initiatives such as ESG and EDI, which are causing a mass loss of meaning. And it's really a spiritual issue. It's not just a business issue. We need to acknowledge this. Of course, the supply chain and financials matter. That was the crux of my previous talk on company turnaround. But I think we're moving into an accelerating effort to keep people in fear, when in fact brands are all about relationship experience, and without meaning, people are just going to be disengaged. So the challenge is, how do we get back on script, which is what I'd like to discuss with you and share some thoughts on. I think as well, it doesn't really matter if things are ordered versus chaos. And I think it's still, a business can still be meaningful or meaningless in those environments. And I think historically the Christian structure has been a series of pillars, which some of which are simple, so simple that people don't notice them, and some of them are complex and people can't understand them. But a lot of them, either way, are unseen and taken for granted, but replaced with extreme. Or I suggest they should be replaced with extreme caution. And I think we've got this fundamental of humility versus gratitude, and gratitude versus the overstepping with excessive pride, which we can see in this EDI methodology, woke methodology, ideology, ESG, WTO type ideology. And I think the crux as well, in terms of historically what's worked and what hasn't, evicting faith is a strong focus, and yet no civilized society has ever survived on a faithless basis. And I think there's a lot of effort to hold people in fear with the lockdown, etc. And this is exactly the same methodology that Hitler adopted to hold people in fear, because it prevents thinking. And I think as well, people are sort of realizing along the journey that these ideologies are not working, and they're sort of rushing to conclude things. So if you look at the WTO, the Great Reset, they're just not smart enough, and yet they carry on regardless in this sort of haze of fear, an effort to silence people along the way. So I think the other question is, why have we got so many issues? They've always been there. These issues have always been there. I think the challenge at the moment is that the wrong people are thriving, and the people who care about trust, truth, and what's good seem to be suffering very badly. And I think this whole thing around gender dysphoria, and systems to make that mainstream is actually corrupting masses, when we really shouldn't design processes for the exceptions. We should manage those, treat those people with respect, but we, in bringing that into the fore, that's actually corrupting a lot of people. We never base a process based on exceptions or victims, which is a very weird sort of response. And I think this is obviously quite a harsh criticism, a lot of things that are going on, but it's in no way self-serving. It's no attempt to wing it or to fake it, but just an attempt to get us to think about the issues and get us back on script. So I think fundamentally it's important to recognise the traditions that gave rise to you and me, which are things like male, female, sex, government and family. These are and institutions, these sorts of structures have taken hundreds of years to evolve, and valuing truth, oddly enough, has been very hard earned, despite the fact that postmodernism seems to be ripping it apart in recent times. And I think there's a distinct danger, which is what we're facing at the moment, of mass misalignment, which is creating a huge burnout, and not just a huge burnout, a loss of meaning along the way. And the challenge with this as well is that perfection is never going to happen, and the fundamentals of Christian faith as a model to consider are grace and love, because you do not know better, and nor do I. So I think some of the underlying tenets that I picked out from the pandemic situation are growth and domination versus relationships and profit. Growth and domination have dominated the mantras and the content of MBA programs for the last 40 odd years, and you can see what's happening, trashing the planet, versus relationships and profit. And it's a gift from God to appreciate what you have, which is a way of keeping growth under control. Is that growth is the ethos of more, which is a curse. It's a curse not to appreciate what you've got. So, and yet you can see in the UK the growth mantra continues almost at any cost, including funding it with debt. So I think there's obviously a cost to what's happened over the last 40 years, these mantras, from a sustainability perspective, and it's going to make us less wealthy, that's for sure. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we can't run businesses with more profit and reduce consumption, yet the growth illusion continues. So these mantras of growth and domination are very powerful. So I think as well, this notion of happiness as well, being dependent upon circumstances, actually it's actually a sense of inner joy that keeps us going, and love and grace enables that regardless. And joy is actually found in difficulty. It's part of the process, whereas I think at the moment, well, in recent times, we've just had it too easy, and civilizations tend to turn on themselves once they've had it too easy. So fundamentally, I think from a pride perspective, one of the questions that we should consider is, do we know better than God? And Jesus said the proud are an abomination. And as I said, an abomination is a feeling of disgust or loathing or a feeling of hatred. So it's really quite it's by far the most dramatic thing that Jesus ever said. And of course, if you're proud, you don't see the opportunity to improve as well, so you're stuck. So, and I think given that, you can see this, how we can't get off growth and domination and the implications of that. And we're drifting back following the pandemic, which shined a light on the value of relationships, like an alcoholic, back to growth and domination with sort of increasing desperation. And this is a sort of hell, because thinking you know better than God is really a very dodgy place to be. And yet, as well, being able to rationalize what's right or wrong without having a robust source of ethics is really very difficult. And we're certainly not capable of making up our own ethics or even purpose. So, fundamentals around what really matters are relationships. Jesus was all about relationships, and profit's important as well, because it creates freedom and it reduces indebtedness. So, I think, what does good look like? I think the important issue is maintaining dialogue, to good and productive dialogue, and open dialogue, because we're moving into a sort of weird, complex and accelerating situation where our ethics are getting confused and unclear, and we've also got a real focus on narcissism, which is self-involvement to the degree that makes people ignore those around them, which is really a very dangerous situation. And ethics is obviously the moral principles that govern what we do. And I think the challenge is, how do we achieve this without creating a tyranny? All tyrannies are based on ideology rather than freedom of individual, and we seem to be drifting back to that ideology, thinking we're smart enough to do that with technology, artificial intelligence, and WTO, all that sort of stuff. And yet the Christianity model is around freedom and relationship and taking counsel from Jesus, from which ethics flow. So, and I think the cost of the alternatives are pretty clear in terms of silencing the woke ethos, the threats, the victimhood, the scapegoating, the terror fueled by social media and the cancel culture. And these are exactly the same mechanisms that gave rise to Hitler or Stalin. And actually the big four are adopting these as well. They're riddled with EDI, thinking it's a great idea, without really understanding the underlying psychology, which I'd suggest is truly dangerous territory. Tech too is also religion. More tech will sort things out. AI reducing bias, when in fact AI is all about bias. And bias in humans is actually what makes us human. So you have to be careful with that. It's not bad. And I think it's obviously addictive as well. And it builds a monster because it triggers dopamine. There have been efforts to design tech systems to avoid triggering dopamine, but it in fact builds a monster in your head, looking for the reward. And things that require no effort, like social media and or sort of woke-related ideology, are the most damaging triggers. And to a degree, I think affluence is also where things have been too easy. People have been spoilt for too long. So I think we have to be careful what we wish for in this situation. Wishing for getting back to growth and ease is not necessarily what utopia looks like. And I think that within all of this, the pride holds people stuck, and that's why you can't improve. So I think it's worth recognising that we're also trying to regulate this with tech, crypto, and WF type methodology, and creating lies, through the woke ideology, making out the postmodernists making out that everything is a sort of human construct rather than being factual. And I think that started off pretty well, because it was a means of rationalising. How do you rationalise what's right or wrong? But it's also worth acknowledging that everybody is unique and everybody has a view, and that's actually a means of holding us sane. But the woke solution to this was derived by controlling power, and taking power and infiltrating systems and then creating division to take power from the traditional system. So this was this is based around lies going back to the 1950s. But the challenge with this is that the ideal model just is impossible to define. It's the ultimate madness to think you can define it. When in fact, when you look at what has worked historically, Socrates and Plato acknowledged a long time ago that local and global collaboration, even in their day, was critical to human survival. So why the hell am I interested in this? Well, it's the same sort of psychology related to company turnaround. But rather than look at company turnaround, I think we're facing crisis of meaning. That's why I'm elaborating on some of these points. But the same way a business strategy gets corrupted, it's the same way that meaning gets corrupted. And the challenge without ethics is we can't resolve what's right or wrong. And I think the pandemic highlighted what was good, what was the basics of humanity. And yet people are considering, it's some sort of biomechanical challenge or there's a tech solution, when in fact it's far simpler, it's far more basic, which is around maintaining relationships and dialogue between us as being what keeps us on track, as well as facing facts. And facts and truth is a journey rather than outcome. And open dialogue is critical rather than, the offence, the framework of language and taking offence, which is the antithesis of open dialogue. And I think the challenge with this is also that we seem to be entering a period whereby there are more and more people doing parasitic, non-value added activity, which is eating up the productive economy, which is pretty concerning. And I think the ultimate madness is that we think we can control this complexity with some sort of AI system, which of course is just a nonsense suggestion on many fronts. And I think as well, you can see the challenge of isolated or the implications of not having relationships and counsel around us. The Putin war. There's even been calculations as a 1 in 6 chance based on technology that there may be a nuclear war. But it's nonsense because one thing could change in Putin's head. And it could be 1-to-1 chance. So it's just ridiculous to suggest that we can predict human behaviour. And I think we're losing sight of critical thinking as well, because energy pricing is around marginal pricing. Rather than address that issue directly, we seem to have gone along with it rather than get to the root cause. And I think we're also being faced with, when the music stops, people get caught with their trunks down, so to speak, or the water level drops. And we've got a lot of pointless businesses being fueled by debt, with no profit or future. And these tech parasitic businesses are getting found out. And I think the people's capability to process the complexity that we're facing is far too complex anyway. We need local communication and global communication effectively to actually drive the change at individual level, rather than assuming it's someone else's problem or assuming that we can drive it centrally, which is just the most tyrannical and unproven. Well, it's actually very obvious what's going to happen, which I think is what we're experiencing with loss of control and loss of mental health. So I think the actions as well that we should take are very much our own actions, rather than assuming that other people are going to fix this, or we can fix other people. So I think freedom is critical as well, which is about valuing individuals for who they are, and that's the trigger for them behaving well, and also giving them the right opportunity. What I think is happening as well, which is intentional underlying a lot of the WTO Great Reset, is we're creating simpler industries which provide less opportunity. They provide less wealth, make less profit. EVs, for example, the Volkswagen, huge loss-making industries. China are dominating, very little chance of making the money. And also with eliminating so-called boring jobs, which is very cruel on the less able people in society, where they get value out of doing that sort of work and contributing to society. AI as well, I think, is a great misnomer. and I've studied it closely, simply that we will not be able to keep up with the outputs or the inputs of AI. So, and working alongside it is a nonsense, because the outputs are digital, and our intelligence is determined by relationships and the people we've got around them. So I think who's going to fix this? How is this going to be fixed? It's going to be fixed by strong people speaking out. It's not going to be fixed by a populist coup, rather like Solzhenitsyn. Yet, we've still got this self-fueling tyranny, woke ideology on one hand, and talking about mental health on the other, which is just bizarre conflict. And I think there's lots of booby traps along the way, which are being covered up with the dialogue and the silencing, such as the WF. China are a bigger threat than Putin, and no one's talking about them. And I think the purpose of this talk really is to try and shine a light on some of these issues and create a line in the sand to promote some thinking around this. I think it is a time for the hyper courageous to come to the fore as well, because the wrong people are thriving, and the right people are really suffering badly, as well as losing touch with reality for the reasons I've described, in terms of distorting, deleting the facts, and preventing people from speaking out. And it's the dialogue that actually discovers the truth. So I think, coming back to actually how do you cut your skills and how did I cut my skills, I came out of industry, and frankly, you couldn't screw it up. If you did, it came back and hit you very hard very quickly, and you learn and live within your means, as opposed to tech companies, which are largely fueled by debt, and the rubber doesn't hit the road, so they don't really learn a huge amount along the way. And I remember stopping factories of 2,000 people that we had to resolve. When we did make mistakes, it was much harder to make money in a productive economy. I think this is part of the problem, and part of the ease, and part of the attraction of tech businesses, where it's quite simple potentially to create something, grow something, even though it's got really very little value at all. And I think the other side of this, it's all about tech, particularly social media business, about controlling attention, which is around triggering dopamine. And dopamine is the same system that triggers alcohol. Alcohol triggers as well, so it's no light matter. as well as people getting stuck in echo chambers, investors getting corrupted, and these tech businesses are actually attractive because they grow without working capital, so they're pretty much inflation proof. So, and I think the way these are maintained is by being maintained by weird dialogue. It's basically the structure I described in the first place, which is sort of Christian structure, largely which we're not particularly familiar with, which is very common to Islam in many ways. It's been replaced by a structure of weird dialogue, unproven, which takes us away from reality, without the rubber hitting the road, and woe behold anybody that challenges it. And yet the dialogue, for example, is tech is the future, governments are driving inflation, the fall of gilts, fueling the sort of cryptocurrency madness. And the issue is really quite a severe one to resolve, and yet very few people have got an interest in upskilling to face it, and all the skills to actually recognise how to face this challenge. And China really are the experts at this, and they've got a huge issue which is around their population demise, which means they need to take over other countries. So the Belt and Road Initiative is all about that. And as well, we're by far, the UK is by far no angel in this situation, because we feel the TikTok opium war, which was far from being helpful. So I think, just to touch on what does good look like here, it's like a jazz band. It's like the intimacy between people, working together, improvising and adjusting on the job, with intimate relationships, intimate communication, and with looking at the audience. That's what good looks like, and that's where the means of, as a metaphor to steer the ship, and seamless strategy execution, and that also acknowledges people for who they are as individuals, values people for who they are as individuals, which is critical to mental health. I think the other part of this is that grace is absolutely critical, and I think going back right the way back to Roman times, despite the circumstances, Julian AD 330 said, "Why do you Christians look after our poor when we kill you?" You know, it's about having that heart of grace and love, regardless of circumstances, which really matters. And I think having had this demise of, extended period of comfort, it's led to a demise without sort of renewal or sacrifice, which has caused us to turn in on ourselves. So, you may well think, what's Christianity got to do with anything? Well, actually, Jesus was, by any means, any measure, the most influential person that ever walked on this planet. He turned up to save the human race by having a valuing. It's all about relationship with us, and he reset the date. So the date that you live by now is actually his birthday date. So who else has ever lived up to that type of status? And Jesus answers the ultimate question, which is, what's our purpose? Jesus said, it's about loving me, love God and love other people. That's the only commandment that matters. And he died on the cross to create that, and he sacrificed in order to create that situation. And so from that place, that's really what good looks like. And notice that wokeness is absolutely the antithesis of that. It has no recognition of truth, beauty, grace, forgiveness, it's absolutely critical that collaboration is critical to making things happen. And when I look back to really good engineering feats, the Spitfire was designed in 6 weeks, for example, without any computers whatsoever. Some of the flaws in human psychology as well was around, if you take steam versus internal combustion engines, for example, the steam engine was regarded as being associated with a heavy locomotive, as opposed to the internal combustion engine, which is regarded as being small. Hence the psychology of why internal combustion engines took off. But I think a lot of businesses were started, like Lucas that I work with a really good ethos, really straightforward ethos. And I think the big challenge here is, how do we cope with sort of unbearable sort of situations or too difficult situations? What we do is we distort and delete the facts, which is the professionalization of wokeness. And what that does is it justifies the status quo. So someone might say, well, we've got a pension deficit, but everybody's got a pension deficit. And this then gets promulgated by powers, but it undermines the structure of democracy, institutions, ethics, and dialogue. When you try and impose ideology on top of this, it just undermines what good looks like, and also undermines investors. So investors, when they're investing in these tech businesses, are not, for example, looking at checking gross margins. So, and I think it's really critical that we maintain good and free open dialogue. And from a faith perspective, the devil is actually defined as being the deceiver, and the root it's actually the root of the word diabolical as well. So I think the question is, at the moment, are we really interested in what people think, or are our communication skills deteriorating? What can we reverse? Because we're very bad at reversing things. So a lot of this technology, can we get off technology? And the implementing ideology to fix issues is very dodgy territory. Marx, Stalin, Hitler, they all tried that. And in fact, the left-wing ideology killed a lot more people than the right-wing ideology last century. So, and the crux of that is not valuing individuals, and there's this victim scapegoat blame dialogue. So that's really important to pick up in what people are saying. And it's all around entitlement, and that it's really around neo-Marxism, and it never gave rise to anything that's successful. When I was born, that's not saying that by any means that the good old days were good old days. I was born in 1967, where being gay was illegal, and it was also the time when women in computing, the UK computing industry collapsed because women were not allowed to be in management positions. But I started my career on the flip side, when there was a clear purpose in organisations and the simple focus to be the best. And also China produced a load of rubbish as well. So some stuff was outsourced to China, but I think in the background, there's been a lot of industry in the UK that's never really made and sold things. The financial industry and now the technology industry, which has always been a burden. And I think since the 1970s, there's been an ethos and focus on more. And in the 1970s, there was a relative focus on austerity, which is around glass milk bottles and simple sustainable actions, which were part of the furniture. But that was replaced in the 1970s with the theory that growth and more would be the source of happiness, and consumption ensued, and it generated unproductive industries. And ultimately, at the moment, we've got what I describe as being parasitic tech industries charging economic rent, which is charging excessive margins. So, for example, Google advertising or Booking.com taking a large chunk of the profit from the productive part, or the service being the hotel providing the service. And during this time, prices have been kept very low with China, which has really set us back quite dramatically. So I think China have also looked to they don't compete, they attack. So they control most of the raw materials in the world now. 95% of rare metals in electronics. They control a large chunk of lithium processing in the world, and they trash economics. They trash models. So such industries such as steel, manufacturing, these industries are very highly reliant because the Chinese have trashed the ability to make profit. And also, I did an estimate of what a bike cost 30 years ago, before we started outsourcing, and now, and inflation's gone up 2,200, and the product's still worth the same. So there's just no value in a lot of these products. And as well, China pick off particular products, such as I bought a guitar for my daughter, and there was one guitar in the shop for 120 quid, which was substantially better than any other ranges. So they pick off specific products to attack an industry, so to gain market entry in the foothold, and then they attack from that place. So very divisive, non-collaborative industries. And in fact, there's no real positive case studies whatsoever of where China have improved their foreign direct investment policies, always made where they've invested worse. So there's some thoughts. So part two of this talk: how does this psychology manifest itself in business? The first thing is intermediated business model. This is around sort of rental models where the assets are centrally controlled, which is the model that I expect that EVs will fit into, and because the assets are too expensive for individuals to own largely. Yet EVs actually facilitate that. EVs are not good for the planet. 70% of the CO2 is created in building the battery of the whole life of the vehicle, versus a IC engine. So this model actually fits the WTO agenda in terms of simplification and reducing wealth for individuals. And I think the challenge with a lot of this stuff is, can we make money more honestly in a way that builds relationships, profit and work for people, and creates opportunities? And tech industries completely controlling attention, addicting people, manipulating without any ethical sort of basis. And also there's big returns for venture capitalists in these situations, because they are not reliant on working capital to scale these businesses, and they scale yet fail, yet there's no relationships or profit. So they grow, dominate for a while, and then just sort of fall to pieces in a sort of puff of smoke, a bit like cryptocurrency. And I think the challenge with these industries is they're making us poorer overall. They're diverting profit from productive industries, controlling pricing, and also causing big damage to the planet. So ASOS, for example, is a case in point. The sort of clothes they produce, 60% of those clothes get chucked straight into landfill without being worn. Yet most people go along with this sort of business model, and if you speak out against this stuff, you'll get clobbered versus an echo chamber. So there's a lot of pressure and difficulty speaking up. So the other aspect of this is actually sort of what I describe as being professionalising mental illness, which is around the gender dysphoria. I mentioned this earlier around designing a process for the exceptions, for example, the trans people, and this creates a contagion in girls by girls empathise with each other, and this is a mechanism to divide and conflict and trash nuclear families and ethics. If you don't agree with me, look at the ethics behind the Black Lives Matter website and the early origins of postmodernism in the 1950s. And yet this is enshrined in education, which is just the ultimate process in terms of educating, fueled by lauding offence, which is a response, infantile response and a narcissistic response. To think that someone defining their identity, no matter how ridiculous that might be, become hypersensitive, like a 2-year-old sort of reaction, and narcissistic by thinking they're smart enough to define their identity or redefine their identity. And yet the sanity is actually defined externally. You can't define yourself, and you can't expect people to accept you necessarily just because you say this is right or this is me. Our sanity is defined by what other people think, largely. Woke arose, as I mentioned, from the 1950s, and it was derived from infiltrating systems at the top level and then infiltrating at the bottom level, with a view to attacking institutions, destroying nuclear family. And it creates blind spots. So, for example, when George Floyd tragically died, which was just the most horrific murder, the following week exactly the same happened to another white man, and that didn't make the news. So this is an example of the blind spot, exactly the same process. This is actually, you look at the analysis, this is actually a police, it was trained, the police were trained to restrain people in this way, which is obviously a major threat, and that was the root cause, notwithstanding the specifics in that situation. So the critical thing is to watch out for these blind spots and the silencing and the victimization, and what it's all about is corrupting identity, and the labeling, the isms, the racisms, the accusations, anti-trans, all this sort of stuff, which are utterly flawed, reduce the will to fight by corrupting people's identity. So this LGBT stuff is all about corrupting people's identity to reduce people's will to fight. And within that, it's a disaster, because by crying wolf, by making these false accusations around racism, transism and the rest of it, the real crimes go unnoticed, which is just disastrous. And it suits the Hollywood stars as well, because they get browning points for associating themselves with this sort of woke ideology. But of course it has no identity. So in terms of recent history, the big wake-up call was the pandemic. The summer of 2000, we began to realise again the value of relationships, and some might say that was Jesus returning to earth. And it's really around, the sort of the outcomes of that was an appreciation of the sustainability, using less and getting back to basics. But tech grew during that period of time because people were isolated and people became more reliant on tech. Within that as well, there was the unresolved issues, the big issues such as German sourcing gas from Russia. Trump warned against this. In fact, I had a conversation with Guy Hans about 10 years ago about a war breaking out in Russia. Big blind spots. And China, that said, despite the fact we're distracted with Russia, are actually still a very much bigger threat with a much more aggressive, more capable plan. And I think the WF is another one. Their plan is to replace whole industries, create products that people can't afford. They're taking Dutch farmers off their land as well. They're infiltrating the Dutch government by introducing nitrogen measures. And the Dutch are the most productive farmers in the world. And the nitrogen measures are a WEF attempt to take their land by making their farms uneconomic. So I think, coming back to what I said before, following the pandemic, we captured these top 7 learnings, which are these: creating work for all, increasing prices and profit to reduce consumption. Number 3, reusing to protect the planet. Number 4, protect people relationships to reduce suicide. Number 5, support a local community. Intimacy acknowledged, and value everybody's view, which is a replacement for the inclusion and respect for the individual as opposed to group ethics. And lastly, put others first. And there was an additional one which was basically to avoid China. The other issue with this is, as well, all of these tools, the acid test in terms of ethics is, do they look after the less fortunate in society? And certainly, if you look at these tech models, they're very much elitist. You know, we'll sort of look after our own, create our own countries type morality, and leave others high and dry. And the other thing is also to recognise, from a humility perspective, if you're feeling self-righteous, you know, if you look at the motivation for the Iraq war versus Putin's war, our justification for the Iraq war is probably worse around WMD versus Putin being concerned about the growth of NATO, which is a bit similar to what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis. And China as well, you know, making assumptions or assertions such as order versus chaos, that sort of propaganda. They're the experts at propaganda, very misleading. And PayPal as well, introducing this sort of social scoring, formalising, you know, the cancel culture. So I think the critical thing in terms of alternative strategies are grace and love. I talk about this on MBA programs at Cranfield and Ashridge. The reason why that's important is the ability to put the past behind, and the alternatives, and forgive. The alternative to forgiveness is anger, and fear and anger create bad decision making, break relationships, which sounds pretty familiar. And this is all, of course, fueled by pride. So I think the consequences of recent actions are Putin has become isolated during the pandemic. You can see the consequences of isolation on people. So you might think tech is an answer to that. Actually, no, it's actually atomizing people rather than connecting people. China agrees with Putin as well that growth of NATO is bad news, and both of which are flawed, because both are tyrannical regimes with no dialogue and little grace and love. Although Putin rightly actually does claim ethical high ground, rejecting the woke ideology, which he acknowledges actually caused the downfall of the Soviet Union, interesting enough. So we're by no means on moral high ground, which is important to challenge our humility. So I think well-being is determined by valuing people for who they are, acknowledging people for who they are, and taking interest in their relationships. And I think the alternative to that is the woke view of destroying traditions to create the utopian man and define rights, where hatred replaces emotion because it's the only alternative, although love is the only indestructible emotion. Blindly follow science, and so it's vital. I think we've learned to rediscover our humanity. That's what the Winning Thinking program does. It reconnects people, it changes the dialogue to develop relationships. And the bottom line as well, within these tech industries, we're not creating new industries of work. In the good old days, farmers bought tractors, tractors became an industry, and the tractor industry took place, people were employed, and things move on. With technology, this is not happening. We're not creating new industries that employ people in the same way. And the crux of Winning Thinking, chapter 1, is all around when things get tough, look after each other, otherwise things collapse. So that's a pretty useful line in the sand. So I think the psychology behind the Great Reset is destroying traditions to build the future. Rather than acknowledge the past, and which is all part of our identity, the notion of a utopian man and socialization within these sorts of LGBT plus rules, the critical race theory, all that sort of stuff. Attack the nuclear family, which is the constructive society. Denial for human reciprocity. Everything in sort of humanity needs agreement, and create this sort of perspective of good and evil, and fear. So there's no sort of dialogue. There's no challenge in the dialogue. It's a very fragile framework that's created, which is obviously creates polarization and these accusations, these labels, isms, anti-trans, and all these other lies that are perpetrated without basis. I think we can see this as well with the WTO, which is actually international socialism, the centralization, and tech as well. The Bill Gates type of view, he's getting quite socialist in his outlook. And there's a sort of hatred for people who own land. And interesting, the woke people talk about the marginalised, but they really don't care. They don't care about the poor. So Jesus said about this, love thy neighbour, which is the crux of society. Without reciprocity, we really are in quite a difficult place, leading ourselves to disintegration, people not caring. And caring really is defined by valuing truth, valuing what's good and what's beautiful. And if there is no effective dialogue to reach those places and appreciate those things, you're effectively creating escalating rework with no learning. So you're creating a lot of unintended consequences, and a lot of silencing going on. Information's restricted and very insular. People have got no idea what's going on, and young people are so wrapped up in social media they can't see left or right. They can't see what's going on in the outside world. Alongside communication skills reducing, so when something difficult crops up, people haven't got the courage or they're too busy really to have conversations, so they just move on to something else rather than challenge each other and develop empathy, and just sort of focusing on looking after yourself, which is the first start of certainly a company collapse, if not a society collapse. So I think the other thing is being addicted to tech. You can't think properly. There's no counsel, and this creates an escalating challenge with no learning and more fear, and it gets fueled by more and more tech, etc. as we move forward. So I think the communication is the basis of relationships, and the Bible talks about this. So Jesus said, love God, love other people, which is the roots of ethics. It's also if you don't love God, what do you love? I think we are love machines. We love all kinds of other things, maybe money or all kinds of things, a lot of which aren't particularly good for us. Do we know better than God? We are made in God's image, which is all about valuing freedom in the individual. He who throws the first stone is without sin. Looking after the poor, meek shall inherit the world, or the earth. It's a gift from God to appreciate what you have. Giving is 50 times more more blessed than receiving. That was 50 times, which actually came from Harvard. They did a study on that. Bringing things into the light, that are difficult rather than silencing people. Critical for maintaining ethics. And from freedom, actually ethics follow, not control, not trying to get people to fit within values. That actually has the opposite effect. So I think that from the pandemic, it's important that from the crisis we learn to look after each other, look out for each other first and foremost. Otherwise, things will collapse. We restore productive relationships, what's good, beautiful, and true. And so, it's quite subtle actually. Some of the social media aspects, with regards to LinkedIn, we're very subtly trapped, and we're linked to these things which are sort of social screwiness and drifting into cancel culture. And in a fairly informal way at the moment, if you looked at LinkedIn, what it bans, it's fairly informal, but it's tech will formalise this because the sheer scale of dialogue is on Twitter or wherever is utterly out of control. And I think the challenge is, unless you acknowledge that you're doing something wrong, you've got no chance of actually upskilling to face it or sort it out, which is pretty concerning. And so increasingly, I think people are becoming more insular and less interested, which of course is a huge risk to society. So I'd argue there's a few sort of at the top level big problems. First of all, the totalitarian state only works based on lies. It's too complicated to define those rules, and yet freedom and humility and self-awareness are the routes to fix that. It's hell both ways, both in terms of facing the issue and or distorting, diluting, using some of the woke ideology or WA type ideology or whatever type of ideology. Honesty is difficult, and it's easier to distort and delete rather than actually face and resolve issues. Tough issues need to be faced, and you can't win against those you can't say no to. So Putin, the economy in the West is largely, well, Europe is largely reliant on Russian gas and the city implications of that. We can't actually say no to him. So it's important we maintain relationships with these people first and foremost. And the other thing is, Virgin Airways just launching their EDI LGBTQ plus type policy, allowing people to swap uniforms, which is a slippery slope and very difficult to weed out. It's neo-Marxism at its core. So the big three investors, Blackstone, Vanguard, are all into ESG, which sounds great, but in fact they're dictating woke policies into companies and buying up property en masse. Again, taking control of the economy, actually adopting more of a sort of country-focused sort of view of things and undermining governments. Bill Gates is controlling quite a bit of media, investing a lot of money in US government communications. The EV car industry employs no one, which mentioned before, or very, very, very many fewer people. And the aim of the WTO is to reduce the wealth so people have less control, no money, and things are sort of centrally allocated based upon a sort of minimum wage type of thing. In the background, they pump up and control the asset prices to drive people out of their homes and or off their farms in the case of Dutch farmers. And I think the challenge with this is we can't stop. I wrote a book on why we can't stop. It's because we're not good at undoing things, and tech is actually addicting us, and it's accelerating this madness. So rather than slow down and think, people are just people are realizing that these strategies aren't working, but they're accelerating these strategies rather than slowing them down. And in that, it's creating more and more fear, which is creating more and more silence. The business models are creating parasitic activity where the rubber isn't hitting the road, as I said before. So there's no real check on the valuation of a business or crypto, which I'll come on to a bit later. And China controlling other countries because of their low growth in population, which is all down to the control of the Belt and Road initiative, which they've launched. And so there's also a systemic trashing of faith, which, as I said, is the only common denominator that's held together civilized societies. No societies have ever survived for any period of time without faith, and the critical aspect of that is dialogue. So, going back right to the roots, communication, valuing communication, it's important to understand the source. So who is Tom? What do you know about me? What do you know about people who are speaking to you? Else you ignore it. It has no value. And so the logic, and Socrates noticed this, because when people started to talk, that was a development from or writing was a development, or the other way around. So it's about understanding the source of where the information is coming from. That, in fact, when writing was introduced, and chatbots, of course, just don't care. They don't have that connection with the root. And there's a real art to dialogue. We've lost an appreciation of the power of dialogue. We've also lost those touch points in business in terms of being able to get through to people rather than processes. And these are all touch points in the normal course of events, which keep us relatively sane, because these touch points actually are what our sanity is defined by these touch points and the network around us, as opposed to operating in isolation with tech. So there's been a real rise in socialism, inaction, and blaming the government. And the problem with reliance on government is that it's the route to becoming poor. Socialist economies always fail. They also always end up being violent and controlling dialogue as well. They never end well, and that immobilizes innovation as well. So they become very, very poor. And so, just talking a bit about Bitcoin, and pointless industries, and meaningless industries. I think the dialogue is important to understand. So the Bitcoin crew, or the Bit Boys, talk about governments intentionally deflating currencies, reducing the value of currencies, and justifying therefore that Bitcoin is the answer to this. And the latest one is actually boasting that the value of gilts is dropping off a cliff. When in fact, actually, who's actually going to pick up the pieces? Inflation, actually printing money, is a Keynesian thing, which is a means of keeping the wheels on in a downturn. Otherwise, you run out of cash, which is very nasty. But Bitcoin is actually a form of gambling. It's addictive. It's effectively a Ponzi scheme, because people are acquiring it along the way. It's always the people who join now are always out of luck, because that's. And Warren Buffett says that it's only worth what the last person's willing to pay for it. So when the last person's not willing to pay more money, then the price completely collapses. It's all based on speculation. There's no cash flow or utility. There's no means of evaluating the value, unlike a government currency or a company. It's an accounting entry for a non-existent asset, and it's unstable. Therefore, as a platform, it's just licensed gambling, and so the SEC in the States are all over it in terms of misleading communications, investment communications. So these are the sorts of things that need to be challenged and undone, which as you can see, we're uniquely bad at doing. And there's a whole ecosystem around crypto, and there's a whole this decentralized finance and setting up countries which are independent of governments' national boundaries. That's the latest sort of freedom, which leaves huge question marks over picking up pieces. I mean, whilst it's utterly nonsensical, fundamentally for the reasons that the currency, etc., won't work, and that there have to be ways of governing that as well. And it just hasn't been thought through. It's just beyond naive, particularly when you consider the impact on people, as we're talking about. So fundamentally, marginalised people behave very badly, and if you marginalise or silence people, the only resort they have is violence. And this is actually what happens with left-wing propaganda, or any sort of propaganda. You can see this violence cropping up around the Black Lives Matter protests. You can see it in China. You can see it in Russia. You can see it in Leicester. Around this sort of ideology-driven propaganda. And so the interesting thing is that tech is a bit like opium in China, in the opium wars. It's drugging people, it's addicting people, it's taking people's eyes off the ball. And China are actually doing that with TikTok. That's one of their tools to do that. It's their new opium. And the challenge, of course, is where's the checks and balances? If the rubber's not hitting the road, there's no checks and balances. How do you stop it? And in the meantime, it's trashing our productive economy and making viable businesses doing something useful less viable, because they're reliant on the tech models, and/or the Chinese have fundamentally destroyed the economic model of making steel or some of these other larger industries. So the sort of issues to resolve is that Without spirituality or a foundation of ethics, a structure, things just don't have any meaning. We're fundamentally spiritual creatures, and if people don't care, it's a very dodgy territory. So the more the challenge gets, the more the meaning needs to be stronger, proportional to the challenge. Otherwise, people just walk away, and you just cannot redefine your own purpose. It's no society has ever survived without faith. It's a single common denominator. It's a structure which is complex and complex or simple, but both of which are unseen. So the challenge is, does dialogue control us, or do we control dialogue? Can we stop doing things like, the next level of madness is metaverse, which is really around accepting the fact that we cannot cope with difficult dialogue. So therefore, stick it on the metaverse so the sort of computers fight it out on our behalf. It's a way of controlling attention, take it to a whole new level, and desensitizing people and just destroying humanity, and the things just been talking about. And I think that it's vital from an ethical point of view. Without spiritual basis, you just cannot ratify what's right or wrong. Some of the difficult things, homosexuality, for example, there's clearly a debate around that, but the Bible's very clear on that, and so is actually the Islam. So what's the reference? How do you define what's right or wrong? And so echo chambers as well, creating polarization on technology. There's an effort to restrict dialogue between people with different views. Critical thinking, it comes back to this notion of a jazz band with the intimate relationships, and the simple trigger for critical thinking is just thinking that's just not right, just doesn't make sense. And there are lots of things like that we're not acting on, we're not speaking up about, and that's where the blind spots and the tyranny comes from, this sort of acceptance of things which are fundamentally right. And things get to a point, certainly as regards most tyrannies, whereby it gets past the tipping point whereby people think this has gone too far, I can't do anything about this. So it's vital that people start taking action now. And the action is down to ourselves. It's not a question of waiting for the government. It's about taking the big decisions, some of the, reversing the Chinese investments, reversing, reliance on Russia, reducing what, you consume, appreciating what you've got, which is a spiritual thing. As I say, that's a spiritual thing which is about appreciating what you've got. It's a gift from God. Otherwise, more is a curse. Reducing social media input to get your input into your system right. Stop taking stupid actions such as the neo-Marxist LGBT stuff. Highly emotive, highly cancerous on society, and silencing. And this victimhood methodologies is professionalizing mental illness. So the notion that somehow woke is helping mental illness is utter nonsense, because effectively you're driving people's beliefs and actions out of sync, which is very dangerous territory. And it also causes you not to face the facts, which creates a ever increasing rework. So big tech, Gates talked about that, faceless, unaccountable sort of systems, accountable to nobody, that people are addicted to, and social media controlling attention, and a lot of business development really depends on this. So and the rise of extremism really happens when people define ideology and there's no counsel, there's no effective counsel, hence Putin and Xi and other such tyrannies. And I think groups fracturing such as NATO, because they are falling out with each other, because their communication skills are getting weaker, when in fact the whole focus is about loving thy enemies. It's about having the right frame of mind, which is very much a spiritual thing. How do you feel when you get out of bed in the morning? It's about valuing individuals as well, for who they are, and it's also about value in terms of diversity, valuing women's role. Let them be women. I remember a while ago, attending quite a few senior management events with women, and it's very clear that women weren't being women. I think we're taking that to a whole new level of madness where men and women are ashamed to be either, with this LGBT stuff, trashing the notion of woman, mother, and or man, and or this notion of toxic male. So in summary, it's important we break this cycle, get off tech, get back in control of your own thinking and yourself, develop a spiritual connection, get ethics right, re-establish relationships, develop caring, get to know each other. This is what keeps us healthy and maintains our sanity. Value thinking and critical thinking. So if something doesn't sound right, challenge it, speak up, and resolve dialogue, breakdown, and or mantras which reduce the ability to speak openly as a means to re-establish relationships. And there's a fundamental structure that sits behind this, otherwise you're sort of locked in fear. First of all, is to develop a moral compass, a common one, which is largely defined by Christianity, and most of which we take for granted. But there's some elements of it are too complex that we can't understand, but it's nonetheless there. Dialogue and grace, and love thy enemy is a great ethos. It's a tough one, but love actually is the only unifying, unchangeable emotion. And become aware of flawed dialogue, what drives us. So the whole framework of dialogue, which is the alternative really to Christianity in woke parlance or postmodernism, is a load of nonsense that's based on a whole raft of lies, and it's just naive in its assumption that it can fix any of these issues. In fact, it's creating a tyranny. And so the acid test of all of this is, frankly, will good people be willing to work for your organisation? And when there's a substantial challenge, is the meaning and the structure there in place? One, to see the challenge, face the challenge, or are you distorting, deleting it? And or have people got the relationships in place to navigate through that together? And you can see a lot of what's happening at the moment. For example, even in the UK, you've got this continuation of the madness of growth in the UK fueled by debt, which is absolutely antithesis. It's talked about growth and dominance, but growth, debt, and dominance is another absurd twist. So you can see how this, the power of these mantras, the importance to challenge them, and underlying this whole thing. It's about the underlying issue is far more spiritual. It's about appreciating the wonder of nature, for example. So when you look at technology and reducing carbon, for example, something I've been involved in recently, the natural systems are first and foremost, to protect the natural systems. Yet, people are not getting that right. So, for example, planting trees on peat bogs is a disaster because it dries them out and releases all the CO2. Second priority is consumption, and third is technology, rather than the other way around. So EVs are very questionable in terms of their environmental impact. In fact, it's very clear that if everybody bought an EV, it'd be an absolute disaster for the planet. Hydrogen as well has a real issue with energy density and storage. So the assumptions around sort of technologies that wherewithal, it's really far more fundamental. It's far more about connecting with nature, becoming much more sober in our outlook, and much more sort of naturally centric, and getting off technology and all of the aspects of it. And I think in terms of us being able to maintain our sanity, our decision making very much depends on relationships. It very much depends on recognizing and avoiding fear. It depends on our communication. Else we just get more and more of the same without any challenge, and we get these echo chambers and glass houses, which is just disastrous. We need to encourage women to be our beneficial adversaries, and women are critical in terms of diversity and managing risk for that reason. We need to have a broader network as well, so a small intimate network, which may be family, but then business network and friendly network, test our ideas on that, and then a broader network of the other people that sit on the periphery to test our ideas against. And let women be women and men be men, to manage risk and speak up. And then the challenge is to reset relationships. I call this logos-centered leadership, where it's about getting the dialogue right, re-establishing relationships, kicking out ideology, which creates the tyranny, creating freedom for people to be themselves, discover themselves, make mistakes, valuing other people, listening to other people. But you can say this, but people need to actually experience it, and that's why we run the Winning Thinking program too, so people can experience this for themselves, and in that way they create this jazz band that can steer through this mess, decide what not to do, what to do, what's flawed, where's the flawed dialogue, and listen and acknowledge people for who they are, and take an interest in different views. Because I think it was Freud that said something like the privilege of a lifetime is to realize who you are and be who you are. The alternative is very stressful, but that's also the crux of how to manage this unbelievable complexity that we're facing. And the challenge starts with us, our behaviours, rather than other people or governments or anything else. And then it's about how do we support other people. It's pretty much that simple. So I hope that's helpful, guys. I felt it was important for me to share this, and also for me to try and get my head around this before it became too complex for me to try and consider what the solutions might be. But I'm sharing this really with a view to raising the debate as opposed to proposing this is a solution. But I do have a solution for repairing relationships and coping with turnaround situations, which you're very welcome to reach out and discuss, because I'm all about action, and I want you to join us on those exciting programs as well. So anyway, thank you very much for listening this far. Bye.
There goes a sight from my soul. There goes a sight, there goes a sight.